Welcome, everyone. It's a few minutes after 6, and so we'll just do a few housekeeping things, and then we'll get going here. And I'm going to start, and then Andy Morgan is going to take over after that. But just a couple of announcements. One, we haven't really been utilizing our raise your hand option when people want to talk. As we've been going, we've kind of gotten lax on that. So tonight, if you have something to say, especially for the video, because when it comes to the video, I'm trying to spotlight the people who are talking, so that gets shown on the video. So it's helpful if I see a hand raised. So if you don't know how to do that, you press your participants button and the little menu pops out there to the side, and you can raise your hand there in that area. Secondly, just a couple of announcements of things that are coming up at 2nd. And for those of you who are not members of 2nd, we want you to know that you're invited to help with both of them. It's not just for 2nd. The first is Thursday night. We are having a physically distant food truck fellowship in the parking lot of 2nd Presbyterian Church, and that will be at 5:30, and it'll go from 5:30 to 7:30. In addition to just being a chance to fellowship, all of the food trucks that will be there are Black-owned food trucks. So we're supporting Black-owned businesses in Knoxville, while at the same time having some fellowship. So bring your lawn chairs and your canopies, and feel free to socialize at a nice, healthy, physically distant spacing in the evening. I just saw in the news that it's supposed to rain. We really need the rain, so I'm not going to complain about that. But supposedly the rain for this part of Knoxville should be done by about 4 o'clock. So hopefully by 5:30 there won't be any rain in the area. But everyone is welcome to that. We've made invitations to several of our sister congregations, and we hope you can join us. The second thing is on Saturday, August the 8th, is our Westview Elementary work day. For those of you who aren't part of 2nd, we go to Westview Elementary School on the Saturday before school opens and just sort of fix up the place. And any of you that want to join us for that are welcome to come. And if you have school supplies to drop off, please do that. You can drop that off at the church between now and then. All right, so let's pray, and then we'll get started for tonight. Gracious Heavenly Father, we thank you that we are able to come together here tonight, and we thank you for conversations past and future, and we ask that you continue to be present in our conversations with one another, that we can gain wisdom and understanding from each other as we discuss issues around justice and around race. We also thank you, Father, for Representative John Lewis and the life that he lived that was so faithful to you. And we ask that you help us to walk in his footsteps of making trouble, always the best possible trouble that we can make, the kind of trouble that would please you, that seeks justice for all. We make this prayer in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. Well, so I just want to kind of recap where we have been and what we have talked about over the last few weeks. And so I want to put something up here on the screen. You should be able to see a definition of prejudice there. We have said that there's a difference between prejudice and racism. Prejudice is an unjustified or superior or incorrect attitude that's usually negative, and it's towards an individual, can be towards a group, but it's usually towards an individual based solely on the individual's membership in a social group. And that social group can be race, it can be gender, political affiliation, religious beliefs, age, disability, ethnicity, nationality, occupation, weight. There are a lot of things that we can be prejudiced about. Somebody's talking. Okay, let me mute everybody. There we go. All right, that's better. Okay, so we've got prejudice, and then we've got discrimination. Discrimination is the behavior or actions that are usually negative towards an individual or group of people. Prejudice is in the mind. People may or may not act upon their prejudices, but discrimination is purely action. It's when people act upon their prejudices. It's when prejudice is put into action. But both of these things are personal and individual. Racism, however, has to do with systems, and that's what we've been talking about when it comes to racism, that racism is interlocking systems of advantage as well as disadvantage that are based on race. And we said way back in week 1 that this encompasses economic, political, social, cultural structures, actions, and beliefs that systematize and perpetuate an unequal distribution of privileges, resources, and power between white people and people of color. So that's a shift in focus from what we normally think of when we think of racism. Racism is not about individual prejudicial attitudes, but on what creates the disadvantage of persons of color and what helps keep that disadvantage in place. And it's important that we focus on these systemic issues because individuals can think, well, I'm not prejudiced and I don't discriminate, therefore I'm not racist. Therefore, there is no racism. And that's simply not true. Racism has to do with the systems that are in place that disadvantage people. And then we said that racism also includes power, that there cannot be racism without the power of one group to exercise its sense of racial dominance over other groups. And then we've spent the last 2 weeks looking at how the history of America shows us that that this power of discrimination and domination has been exercised for white people for centuries against people of color, and that has created systemic discrimination or systemic racism. And so that's where we are when we're talking about racism. We're not talking about individual prejudice. We're talking about a system that is in place that advantages one group, white people over others, the people of color. And so tonight, we've been looking at the discrimination against people of color for the last several weeks. Tonight, we're going to talk about the situation of privilege or advantage that this system has created for white people. So tonight, we're looking at the other side of the coin. So if there's disadvantage for some, there must be advantage for others. And that's what we call white privilege. And we're going to work towards a practical definition of white privilege, but I want to talk about the concept first because there's 2 issues that we have to address. The first is this. There is a problem with this phrase, white privilege. And the problem is that many white people, I know many of them, who hear the word privilege and think, well, that's not me. So when you say that white people have white privilege, they go, well, I don't believe that because I don't feel privileged. And it's because white people have tended to think of privilege as being born with a silver spoon in their mouth, never having to work hard like a trust fund baby, never had to suffer, never had to really deal with any adversity. When we hear the word privilege, we think people who get to sit in the skybox at Neyland Stadium on Saturdays in the fall, people who always get to fly first class. And so for a lot of people, they say, well, that's not me. I don't have that kind of privilege. And so the term white privilege can be off-putting for some right away. So we want to look at this word privilege. The legal definition of privilege is a special right, advantage, or immunity that is granted or available only to a particular person or group. Well, now, if you think about our definition of racism, we're talking about advantages that are given to one group and disadvantages that are given to other groups. And we're talking about groups and not people. So we can when we think of privilege in terms of white privilege, we want to think in terms of a special advantage that is available only to a particular group. So really, if we were consistent with our definition of racism, we wouldn't say white privilege, we would say white advantage. That's a more accurate term. And it helps people to understand a little better what we're getting at. It's the advantages that white people enjoy in our society simply because we're white. And that can be difficult for white people to admit that it exists, to acknowledge that it exists. In fact, most white people want to pretend it isn't there, but in reality, we all know it is. And I want to show you this real quick video clip that is a video of a documentary about Jane Elliott. If you don't know who Jane Elliott is, she's famous for the blue-eyed, black-eyed prejudice experiment that she taught her children. But here's a real quick 1-minute video of her speaking to a group of people.
We don't have any sound.
Yeah, we can't hear it, Tim.
You can't hear it? Well, I wonder why.
There's no sound.
There's no sound on that. You can see the video.
Yes. Our mouth's moving.
But you can't hear the sound. Huh. Oh, wait a minute. Let me try this.
Get back to the beginning.
Okay. Could you hear that?
Nope.
No.
You can't hear that.
It's not running.
All right.
Oh, it's not running.
All right. Well, anyway. So let me just tell you what she says. She is saying to those people that she wants, it's a room full of white people, and she says, I want anyone to stand who would accept being treated the way we treat people of color in our country today. And nobody stands. And then she goes, maybe you didn't understand the question. Please stand if you would be okay being treated the same way that we treat people of color in the world today. And again, nobody stands. And she goes, the fact that nobody's standing means you understand that there's a problem, that you wouldn't want to be treated that way. So why do you settle for other people being treated that way? And so that's a way of getting at this idea that we know white privilege is there, but we don't want to admit it's there. Deep down, we know that it exists, but we don't want to acknowledge it because it would mean questioning one of the deepest held beliefs of white America, and that's the idea that we are a meritocracy, that we have earned everything that we've gotten. And it's threatening to us to think that we have. But remember, our goal here is understanding. So if we want to understand racism in the United States, we have to acknowledge and understand white privilege. And that's what we're going to do tonight. And so before I turn it over to Andy, I just want to tell you a quick story about my own experience with coming to understand white privilege. It happened when I was in junior high school. And I didn't know what white privilege was. And actually, looking back, I probably at the time didn't have the words to put with it. But when I was in junior high, I was a manager on the basketball team. And so the fellows on the basketball team became my really good friends. Most of them were African American. And one night we had a game at 7. And so I asked several of them, why don't you come home with me and have dinner at my house? And then my parents will take us back up to the school. And so they did. So we rode the bus home, and the bus in my neighborhood let me off probably a half a mile to 3/4 of a mile away from my house. And normally when I rode the bus home, I would get off the bus and I would, walk in a straight line to my house because that's the shortest distance between 2 points. But that meant cutting through about 5 different yards of different people. So we get off the bus and I've got these 4 black boys with me, and I start to walk into this person's yard, and they stopped at the curb, and they said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to my house." They said, "Is this your house?" And I said, "No, my house is over there. We've got to walk through these yards to get there." And they said, "No, we're not doing it." And I tried to explain to them that it was okay and that I did it all the time, and they refused. They wouldn't do it. They insisted that we walk on the streets to get to my house. And at the time, I just thought that they were being kind of silly. But I think at some point in that evening, I realized that I had a very different lived experience than some of my closest friends. And so over the years, I discussed that with my friends of color, and I would have a hard time understanding it. But really the breakthrough moment came for me when we were in our adoption class. We had to go through a series of classes in order to adopt a child. And one night they had an African-American woman who was a professor from Vanderbilt come and speak to us for those of us who were considering transracial adoption, so that she could make us aware of some of the issues with transracial adoption. And she said, look, the first time, if you have a child of color, the first time that they hear about slavery, it needs to be from you. The first time they hear the N-word, it needs to be from you. You need to prepare them for this. You need to tell them that they are going to be called this. It's up to you to get ahead of the issues they're going to have to deal with around race. And one of the moms in the room raised her hand and she said, "I just think that that's terrible." She said, "I prefer to raise my child to be colorblind. I don't see race, and I don't think we should teach our children to see race." And the professor said, "Only a white person could say something like that." And she said, "You may have the luxury of not seeing race, but I can tell you that I don't, and my children don't." And it was like the proverbial scales falling from my eyes, like the Apostle Paul, that I realized what she was talking about there. And that's really when I started to really become aware of my privilege, and that I had the luxury of not talking about race, whereas a lot of my friends of color didn't. So that began my journey towards sort of understanding what white privilege was about. And I'm very grateful to the people of color who helped educate me through the years on this. And by the way, which is another facet of white privilege, is that white people expect people of color to educate us about racism when we're the ones who have perpetuated the racism. And yet so many of my friends are so patient and do this and out of love and care. And I know it's got to be frustrating for them. So I'm very appreciative of that. So that's just sort of my story of some of the ways that I began to realize that there was more to this racism thing than just disadvantaging others. And so I'm going to turn it over to Andy now. And Andy is going to help us come up with a working definition of white privilege that will help each one of us.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. And thank you, Tim. Am I unmuted at this point?
You are.
Yes. Okay. Okay. So thank you. And I appreciate I guess everybody's willingness to talk about something that is such a loaded term in our culture right now. If you haven't had a chance to get to the white fragility document, I would really encourage you to do so. It's 12 pages and it's worth your time. And I think it helps us to understand why it can be so difficult for us to engage as white people. I say we, speaking of white people in that context, to engage with conversations like this, mostly because of what we learned from this document. If we look at this, we come to a section called The Invisibility of Whiteness. And this is a really important section for us as we as there's Robert as we engage in this conversation, because there's something implied about race and whiteness, and that implication is that whiteness, if you are a white person, is the norm. And so some of the examples that are given in this document talk about, if you hire, or if there's some people being interviewed for a job where there's 14 people, 2 of which are Asian. Well, what's implied there is there's 14 people, 2 of whom are Asian, then that means that 12 are white. And you didn't say 12 are white and 2 are Asian. So there are some assumptions about what is normal in the United States. And so for white people to have a conversation about privilege, which I think Tim did a really good job of talking about the ways in which privilege is the other side of the coin of inequity, of the lived experience of inequity in the United States. As white people, that's often our only experience with race, is this sense of white privilege. Folks in the white community often don't have to ever think about race because it's not painful for us to think about race in the same way that it might be painful as a lived experience for people of color. And so one of the crux of the argument here in white fragility is that it is painful for white people to confront issues of race because they're uncomfortable by talking about race due to this concept of the invisibility of whiteness. So for us in this conversation tonight, what we're going to do is we're going to try to come to terms with our own encounters and lived experience with inequity. And so if you're a white person, when we go into these groups, I'd like for you to talk about an example or a realization that you had when you read this document about white privilege. Did this illumine in any way your experience of being benefited through the inequity of the system of racism in our culture? Or if you're a person of color, in what ways do you experience the flip side of that? In what ways do you experience a more detrimental share of the American story? So that's going to be one thing that we do. We're gonna seek to come to terms with our own lived experience of inequity. And secondly, what I'm hoping that we can do is form what Tim and I are calling a working definition, which means something that's short, something that's succinct, something that you understand, so that you can go and be an ambassador of racial equity in our culture. Tim and I were joking about this afternoon. None of the folks in this room really need to hear a lot of the conversations that we're having tonight. Folks, for the most part, aren't going to be combative about talking about things like white privilege or coming to terms with inequity in the American story. But there are certainly folks who are in this racial system that perpetuates this injustice, who do need to become aware of issues of white privilege and the ways in which that impacts persons of color. So what we want to do is for you to form a working definition of white privilege that you think you could convey to somebody that you know. Does that make sense? Okay. So the 2 central things that we're trying to achieve here are your own experience. We want you to talk about your own experience with white privilege or with racial inequity, because we first have to, before we can go out, this is just the central message of faith formation. Before we can go out and do something effectively, we have to kind of come to terms with our own personal experience. So that's the first thing. In what ways have you been impacted by white privilege or racial inequity that is detrimental? And secondly, what would be a working definition of white privilege that you could tell somebody that you know who might need to know? If that makes sense. Does that make sense? Okay. So Tim's going to put us in groups. Tim, can you do that?
Yep.
We'll give y'all about 15 minutes. We'll kind of check in, see how everybody's doing. If you need longer, we'll push it to 20, but we'll start with 15. So those two questions, again, are personal experience and then a working definition of how you would explain it to someone who needs to know. All right. So welcome back, everybody. We had a nice conversation in our group, and I hope that everybody did as well. Before we unpack, and I'll just go ahead and throw this out there so people can begin to think if you would be willing to do this. I'd like to invite folks to, we'll take 30 seconds and just kind of share what your operational definition of this might be as we go from this class. Before we get to that point, I think Tim got that video working, and we can watch it. So Tim, you ready to show it?
Oh, I've closed that video. I have another video that I was going to show that I skipped over, but I'll do it at the very end because it's funny and it'll leave us on a laugh.
Hey, there we go. That's good. That's good. All right. Well, would anybody be willing to take maybe 30 seconds so that we can get to as many as we're able to share what their operational definition of white privilege would be?
Go, Jan.
Okay, I'll do it.
Use the raise the hand.
I couldn't find the raise the hand thing. Oh, there it is.
I found you. I got you.
Okay. This just came out of our reading material. Whites are at the center of decision-making and power, even when planning and speaking for others, and this decision-making may or may not involve the others.
Here. Good. There you go, Matt. Matt Casey had a great.
I can do mine. I'll readily admit I was the idiot who was raising my physical hand. Sorry. And I modified ours to include one additional word, but the one we came up with was enjoying the unearned, emphasis on unearned, enjoying the unearned benefits of a current and historical majority, specifically those benefits not shared by the minority.
Yeah, very good.
That's
And
good.
I think I don't know if the group did, but I like the definition because it takes out both the word white and privilege. Obviously, majority and white's somewhat
Can you
synonymous.
say that again, please?
Slowly.
All right, I'll speak slower. Enjoying the unearned benefits of a current and historical majority, specifically those benefits not shared by the minority.
Thank you, Matt. Who else would like to share?
Hey, it's Betsy. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. White privilege is a societal privilege that benefits white people over non-white people in some societies.
Thank you.
Harry's got his hand up.
Am I unmuted? I was going to say,
It's Google.
we really didn't get to that. We were having such a good time telling our stories, but I think one example or one definition perhaps would be to be completely ignorant of it, which is where I was, completely oblivious.
John Kerr.
Yeah, we didn't really get to that because we spent a lot of time talking about experiences. But I think one of the things we did discuss was someone in our group said, when people say, well, I'm not privileged, I didn't feel privileged when I was growing up, the statement that feelings aren't facts. And then the second thing, the questionnaire that we were asked to fill out along with our study tonight to check whether you experience these things, just to be able to bring up, a handful of those to a person that you're talking to and saying, did you have this? Did you have this? Did you have this? Well, that's white privilege. So I think sometimes just some simple, because people, even when they hear sort of a complex definition of it, I don't think they necessarily think that it means that they had it.
Doesn't apply to my experience.
Right.
Not
Right.
us.
Let's hear from one more.
Our group had two definitions. One was living in a white cocoon. And the second was living, being able to live in a house anywhere you want to live.
Thank you all for that work, and for us, for our group too. It was we had a lot of fun telling our stories, and it was eye-opening because so many of us have been, so many white folks have been oblivious to just the pervasiveness that our lived experience has been clouded by our advantage.
Could I say one thing?
Yes.
And I grew up, and I'm never not aware that I'm the black guy in the room. My wife was Puerto Rican from New York City, and I'm from Jersey. We knew exactly. We would always be that. We never forgot that. In our group, we talked about an advantage, which was, to me, my parents taught me how, you know, if you want to do something, you got to push yourself way beyond everything to be there. So for us, and this is a great conversation, and this is great that you all are doing this, but from a lot of colored folks, and I fit in a lot of ways. We never forget that we are that person in the room.
Jim, thank you for that. And I think that one of those important themes that we have heard from this conversation is that white privilege, this flip side of the coin, is really characterized by a lack of awareness from white people of that privilege. And I think that this is the first step towards equity and justice making. So thank you for sharing what it feels like to be on the other side of the coin, where you are very aware of the inequity rather than white folks who often aren't. So thank you for sharing this. You can't get, two pastors can't do this without some kind of sermon being in this. And so I just want to remind folks, I know that we're a mainline denomination, but central to the issue of race is equity, as we've talked about today. And equity is always a theological issue, primarily for Christians. It's a political issue, of course, as we've seen. But for us, God's longing for equity is a central aim of God's kingdom that we're seeking to fall into. So this is theological work that we're doing that just so happens to be political sometimes, and it invites difficult conversations. But when we engage in work like this, we are doing important theological engagement. So I really appreciate y'all's willingness to do that. Tim, will you bring us out on a happy note, as you promised?
Yeah. So I was going to show this earlier. I finally figured out how to do this. As I said, I'm very thankful to people of color who do take the time to help reveal what this looks like on the ground. And I think that's what's important, is for us to figure out what this looks like on the ground. Kimberly Cullum was saying in our breakout group that that this was something that white privilege was something white people needed to work out, and and we do. It's true. It's something that we have to work out. We have to come through. But people of color help us to do that, and some of the best people doing that today are comedians. And so I want to share this little clip of this comedian that was extremely eye-opening for me a couple of years ago. Now I'll just tell you, there's a few colorful words in this thing, but we're all adults. So let me bring him up, and I figured out how to do the sound. So let's do this.
Think about this.
Oh, God.
Oh, my. Oh, thank you for that.
All right. So it's funny, but it's sad at the same time.
Yeah.
And he's getting at that. What I said in my sermon a few weeks ago about the black space and the white space, that there really are two Americas, and we navigate those differently. And I've thought about that a lot during quarantine, wearing masks, thinking about how easy it is for white people to wear masks, but how much fear a black man may have wearing a mask going into a store or a bank. And then when the cashier goes, you don't want the receipt, do you? And I go, no, I don't need it. Trying to keep from handling germs, but then I think about that routine, and people of color have got to have the receipt. They got to have the bag. So I think that highlights an aspect of white privilege that we don't often think about. And like he said, it's not that we're being racist. It's just like Harry said a minute ago, we just don't know until it's revealed to us. And so now that we have thought about it, let's continue to think about it, and let's continue to think of what it means, because at the end of the day, it's not about feeling guilty. It's about how do I recognize and acknowledge the advantage that I have, and then how do I use that advantage to help others and bring others along, which is why I think Andy was getting at with, how do we describe it to other people.
And also, our comedians, from Red Fox to Mom's Mabley, way back when, have always had this sense of humor. Roy Woods Jr. is just one word, and he's got a lot of good things. But that's part of our education, is black humor, and this whole black rhythm that we have to educate us to know what we're facing, just so you all know.
Right.
Pastor Tim, I know I'm just throwing in 30 seconds. I've got a great friend who's in the seminary, but he helped me understand it a little bit like this. I meant to raise my hand, but I forgot.
It's all right.
He just basically said, when Christ was, giving out the gospel, when I think there's a Pharisee lawyer or something that came up to him and he questioned the Lord, and the Lord said, these two things are most important, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, I believe. And then he said, and then loving your neighbor as yourself. So I'm just saying, even when I'm looking as a black person towards white people, I can't, even with the 450 years of racial history in this nation, if I'm gonna be a child of Christ, I can't carry that hatred forward and still be captured by the gospel. So I've got a burden on me too, as a black man reaching towards all of it, white people, that says that if I'm going to be a disciple of Christ, then I've got to have that love that looks at my white brother as my neighbor, as opposed to the person that I'm trying to proportionally get at so that I can be equal with. And I'm going to stop right there because I know we're running out of time, but I appreciate you all.
That was good.
Those are good words.
Good.
That's a good place to leave it. That's a good place to leave it. All right. Well, go in peace to love and serve the Lord. Thank y'all for being here, and certainly wish you guys a wonderful, wonderful evening. And
we hope to see you tomorrow at 5:30. Parking lot of Second Presbyterian Church.
That'd be great.
Everybody come on.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Blessings.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good night.
Good to see everybody.
Oh.
Hi, Catherine.
Hi.
Bye.
Jackie, look forward to seeing you. Good to see you here.
You too.
Hi, Catherine.
Okay.
Bye, all.
See y'all.